Hey everyone, Rivalry here and welcome back to the channel. And today it's time to pull out that psychology degree that I completely fluked to obtain and discuss the concept of bad. There's something very strange about how we consume content on not just YouTube but social media in general. For some strange reason we seem to be drawn to the bad things instead of the good. This video could be titled the best Pokemon game ever made, and it wouldn't draw as much attention as discussing the worst Pokemon game ever made. For reference to anybody, the best Pokemon game ever made is Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Rescue Team, and any other answer is incorrect. No, I will not be taking any questions at this time on why that's the case. There's just something about searching for the worst in everything that we're drawn to. The curiosity to see something that's terrible compared to something that's good. I've been around on the internet long enough, and to be honest maybe too young, to see the rise of things like The Room, a very poorly made independent film that had a very mysterious backing in terms of budget, and was so bad that it grabbed everybody's attention and became a meme. It then led to a memoir from one of the cast becoming a bestseller, and a film adaptation that was actually Oscar nominated. Very weird turn of events, but the draw of the film being so bad was one of the first instances I can remember of people being drawn to something that's just so bad. I also might have just shown my age with that reference. Trust me, I'm not that old. Anyways, we're naturally drawn to seeing somebody play something that's bad instead of good. You don't want to see the angry video game nerd play The Last of Us and discuss how great the game is. You want to see him play something like Sonic 06 or Superman 64 and get angry at how poor the game is. You probably won't watch a video about how nice a Call of Duty lobby was where everyone's polite. Instead, you'll probably watch a compilation one of people screaming and shouting at each other, whilst they think of the most obscure insults possible. Bad just sells on the internet. Playing the bad games just draws a wide audience. So naturally, when you're looking at Pokemon as a fan, you'll probably think, what's the worst Pokemon game ever made? I am certain somebody somewhere is shouting Pokemon Scarlet and Violet is so bad and is the worst Pokemon game ever made, but it just isn't. It certainly has its problems, and it also deserves a fair bit of criticism because of its below average performance on a console that definitely is capable of much more, but it also has its positives as well. It still follows the general formula of battling, has some redeemable factors including being open world, which I think is a great addition to the series. Now, is it the worst main series game? Well, you can certainly have that debate. Usually the worst main series game is whatever the most recent one is anyways. Instead, what I'm looking for is the game that is seen as so terrible in both fan perception and reviews, the only decision we have on our hands is to bin every single copy of it in a desert never to be dug up again. So it's time to head to the reviews and sort by average to see what the worst Pokemon game ever rated is. But before we do that, it's important to establish that Pokemon has a lot of games, and unfortunately there's a criteria we need to set that's going to affect our game choice. Due to Pokemon's exclusivity to Nintendo consoles and phone games, it does mean some games over time have become completely inaccessible, so we can't exactly say it's the worst game ever made for Pokemon because the universe has already decided to wipe it from the face of the earth. So this takes out the lowest rated Pokemon game around in Pokemon Rumble Rush, a phone game that lasted just over a year in terms of a cycle. We also now have games that are completely inaccessible due to shutting down the shop that exists on a particular console. As Nintendo have shut down the Wii, Wii U and 3DS consoles in terms of online accessibility, games such as My Pokemon Ranch and Pokemon Rumble U are no longer accessible to the public, unless you already downloaded it before the shutdown of the consoles. These are also two games that are rated very poorly. Also, just spitballing here, but was My Pokemon Ranch that bad? I didn't think it was like great or anything, but I remember getting it around the time of Pokemon Battle Revolution, and I didn't think it was terrible. Oh, wait, Pokemon Battle Revolution is also poorly reviewed as well. Really? I mean, it's not Pokemon Stadium, sure, but it wasn't that bad either. Looking back on reviews sometimes makes you question what you liked as a kid. Now, just on that criteria alone, that takes out a big chunk of games that might have been considered to be the worst Pokemon game ever to leave only one ruler of the land, and the award for the worst rated Pokemon game ever goes to Pokemon Dash. Now, Pokemon Dash came around as the franchise was about to take the leap to the newly created Nintendo DS. In Japan, it would act as a launch title for the Nintendo DS, a very coveted spot that would need to showcase and highlight the new features of the console, so it was very important that it showcased a dual screen, otherwise consumers would think what's the point in having them. After all, Nintendo are very notorious, whether rightly or wrongly, for gimmicking their consoles and introducing new ways to play. They've unfortunately had some very ill-fated attempts like the Virtual Boy or the VRU on the Nintendo 64, which utilised only 2 games in total, which is a very costly exercise just to be able to play a bit of Hey You Pikachu. On the flip side, they've had some very successful ones like the Switch, which combines both handheld and home console into one. They've always been the biggest innovators in the market, and it's one of the many reasons they've arguably been the most dominant video game company since the 80s, as they've focused on different ways to play instead of chasing the never obtainable video game version of One Piece. That meant that the main goal of Pokemon Dash was to take advantage of the new features from the Nintendo DS, DS. And to do this, they decided to hand it off to a company behind some of the other Pokemon games, including Hey You Pikachu and Pokemon Channel. This said company also went on to make My Pokemon Ranch, Pokemon Rumble U, and Pokemon Rumble Rush. 3 games that were very close to taking Pokemon Dash's crown, if they were still accessible. Luckily for them, they are not. Launch titles can be very important. If you look at the success of the Wii, for example, the console was packaged with Wii Sports, a game that would go on to be one of the best-selling games of all time and really took advantage of the technology and idea behind the Wii. It effectively showed what the console could do. So Pokemon Dash was going to have to be a game that took advantage of what the Nintendo DS was offering. Now the game involves controlling Pikachu and guiding him through various race courses to checkpoints before rival Pokemon. The game focused on using the Nintendo DS's stylus and touchscreen. Players would move Pikachu forward by swiping across the touchscreen, and this essentially made Pikachu run. If the player swiped harder and faster, Pikachu would naturally run faster as well. There are multiple different terrain types throughout the game, including grass, sand, and water, all of which can affect Pikachu's speed. Water is a big hazard in the game, and to combat this, Pikachu can fly via a hot air balloon. The game operates on a checkpoint system that has to be followed in order. The checkpoints won't count otherwise. The game uses both screens, one for navigation and one to touch to move Pikachu. It has 2 primary modes: the Grand Prix, where players can compete in a series of races across themed environments, and multiplayer, where up to 6 players could race using local wireless play. Each course varies in complexity, introducing different obstacles and requiring players to plan their routes effectively while maintaining speed. There is a small level of customization as well. Players can unlock additional Pokemon by connecting to Pokemon Emerald via the magical Game Boy Advance slot. However, everyone's favourite electric mouse is the only playable character. So you may be thinking, what's next? You run through the levels, and then you run through the next, and then the next. What else is there to the game? Well, that's it. There is nothing else to this game at all. Just move on to the next level and repeat. Bear in mind, this is 2004. The complexity of video games are definitely expanded from the original origins from not just Pokemon, but the Game Boy handheld games. And the game was on a new console too in the Nintendo DS. When you compare it to the complexity of some other spin-offs for the Pokemon series, especially the Mystery Dungeon series or even the Ranger series to a lesser extent, spin-offs that came out not long after this game, it naturally meant Pokemon Dash looked completely inferior to the other options you had. As you can imagine, reviews for this game are a sea of red. The game is very basic in terms of design and does not offer much replayability value. In terms of accessible Pokemon games right now, it is the lowest rated Pokemon games in terms of reviews from professional companies. However, while reviews can provide useful insights into a video game, they're not always the final word on its quality or popularity. Some games, despite receiving mixed or even poor reviews from critics, develop dedicated fan bases and even achieve cult followings. A very common reason for this is critics can overlook emotional storytelling or nostalgia, even when a game has some technical flaws. To give you an example, the video game Nier has very low ratings in terms of reviews, but fan perception on the other hand is much higher. Reviews can assess a game's mechanics, design and innovation, but fan reception often hinges on the game resonating with players on a more subjective level. Even when you look at Pokemon itself, it has multiple games that fit into this criteria. One in particular is the Mystery Dungeon franchise. In general, it's very poorly reviewed, but very highly rated within the fanbase, with Explorers of the Sky in particular suffering some of the worst reviews amongst Pokemon games, but on the contrary, it's one of the most highest rated Pokemon games in terms of fan reception, and is probably seen as the pinnacle of the Mystery Dungeon series. Additionally, it's important to recognise that reviews are not always entirely impartial, or can give some unfair criticisms. Everyone knows about the famed Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire review that said too much water, even though it's based on a game that had that amount of water and wasn't a problem beforehand. And there have been accusations in the past of it inflating scores, and it therefore not relating to actual player experience. Moreover, a review is just one person or a small group of opinions, which may not align with every player's tastes. Reviews can give a good basis, but ultimately personal experience with a game is what matters the most. If you engage with a game and form your own opinions based on how fun or challenging or the emotional impact of it, it is far more valuable than relying solely on reviews. Games are, well, meant to be played, and your personal interaction with a game is more important than a review. Now, unfortunately for Pokemon Dash, it's usually not highly reviewed by fans or by critics, but I don't think Pokemon Dash's problems are with the game itself, but with the Nintendo DS. The handheld console has gone on to be the second best selling video game console of all time, currently only beaten by the PS2, though the Switch could easily catch up on that. But the DS suffers with what I like to call unnecessary games for an unreasonable price. The Nintendo DS had a lot of games being released that would be full price but not a full experience. This isn't related to just Pokemon Dash. We have a considerable amount of games that just don't make sense as games. I'll give you a few examples. The Suite Life of Zack and Cody was a very popular TV series that launched the Sprouse Brothers' careers. That and its sequel series, The Suite Life on Deck, rank up there as some of the most popular series made for the Disney Channel. It followed the daily life of Zack and Cody, with one series being in a hotel and the other being on a boat. Very simple in concept, and it made it a good series to watch. But did it really need multiple games on the DS? Not really. Even if some have some good joke reviews nowadays, and trust me, they're worth reading, it doesn't need to be made. Curry in the House has one, Wizards of Waverly Place has one. There's a Deal or No Deal game on the DS, which interestingly enough has two different versions, because the UK and US have different hosts. In total on the DS, there was 3,468 games released over an estimated 10-year lifespan. For comparison, the original Game Boy had 1,043 over a 14-year lifespan. Sure, there was a lot of Game Boy games that were very expensive too, and not worth the price, but it's 2004 and onwards now. There was more of an expectation of video games than ever before. None of the games that I mentioned are the most diabolical games ever made, just like Pokemon Dash isn't the worst game ever made either, but they weren't worth the RRP on launch date. Nowadays, if an indie game was released and it wasn't worth the price, it usually won't be listed at that said price. And I think that's where Pokemon Dash suffers a great amount. It's not a great game by any stretch of the imagination. When you compare it to other spin-off games on the DS, including the very successful Mystery Dungeon series or even the Ranger series, it doesn't offer anywhere near the same level of story or gameplay mechanics. And that's actually fine if the RRP isn't set at a similar height on release date. It's a victim of the brand and price almost. It's very, very low for a reason. The game is very one note, and it's also very short, but it also has the heightened negativity of people remembering that it was a full price retail game that does not have enough content to warrant it. And also being a Pokemon game naturally heightens its criticism. Right now you can buy Pokemon Dash for £12 in the UK, which would be a much more reasonable price if you purchased it on release date. Plus, when you consider some old Pokemon games now go for an extortionate amount of money, it's a very easy one to add to your collection. I think in general, Pokemon Dash is just an inoffensive game. It doesn't break any ground, but I also don't think it does anything harmful either. Its primary issue lies with the price tag it carried on release date. It naturally gave players higher expectations than the simple and repetitive gameplay it offered. While it's not a good game by most standards, much of its poor reputation stems from the mismatch between its content and its original cost, rather than the game itself being terrible. I wouldn't recommend seeking it out, especially because the replayability of the game is incredibly low, but it doesn't deserve excessive criticism either. It was an experiment using new technology. Pokemon Dash was more about the Nintendo DS and showing off its features than being an amazing game. Worst Pokemon game ever? I'm not too sure. It was more of a showcase that probably shouldn't have been as expensive as it was. Thanks for watching, everyone. So, Pokemon Dash is the worst Pokemon game ever made based on rating, but what do you think is the worst Pokemon game ever made? Let me know in the comments below. Make sure to like and subscribe as it really helps out the channel, and follow me on Twitter for more Pokemon opinions. Bye guys.